So today I'm going to be talking about Gen Z dating and marriage trends, how they looked like for millennials and Gen X, how they look like now, and how things are starting to shift. So first, I wanted to talk about the ideas of dating and marriage, what we traditionally think of, or the what we think of as defining these words. So when we think of the definition of dating, we think of a stage of romantic relationships in which two individuals engage in activity get together, most often with the intention of evaluating each other's sustainability as a partner for future intimate relationships. When we traditionally think of the definition of marriage, we think of the legally or formally recognized union of two peoples as partners in a personal relationship. Now, from these two things, along with a lot of different aspects that go into Gen Z, we have now formed what we call a situationship, which is less than the relationship, but more than a casual encounter or a quote unquote booty call. A situationship refers to a romantic relationship that is and remains undefined, a big gray area. A psychotherapist and author journalist from an NBC article, Jonathan Albert, also described it as a situationship is a space between a committed relationship and something that is more than a friendship. So those give you two basic definitions of what we now understand of as a gray area between dating and marriage, which are the two things I'm going to talk about. Next, we're going to look at some statistics that go into this, and I will dive in deeper to what this means. So first of all, we can look at the 75% of Gen Z are single. 56% of women and men have been quote unquote ghosted, a term which I'll talk about later. And 71% say it's a deal breaker if a potential match has a different political view than them. The most popular reason for ghosting is to avoid confrontation, and Gen Z is having less casual sex than previous generations. 24% of Gen Zers have sex on a casual basis, compared to what we have traditionally seen of in the past. These are all very interesting statistics when it comes to just looking without even diving into why or the research this could mean for Gen Z and for the future when it comes to both dating and marriage. Next, we're going to talk about the idea of love. One of the main questions that was looked at when I was doing research is this idea of love. The big question being, are you ready to settle down? Now, through my research, I learned that Gen Z takes an especially pragmatic approach to relationships compared to other generations. And to even view this further, 1 in 10 members of Gen Z say they're committed to being committed, which, and when we put it into the perspective, I guess, of the whole population, it seems like quite a lot, which is interesting. Even for me personally, talking to friends and other things, there's a lot of people who we deem as not ready to be committed, but the statistic shows otherwise, which I thought it was very interesting. Another reason why our idea of love is different than other generations is because we are a very colorful, fluid, and socially conscious generation. I know in the past of classes, we've definitely talked about how our generation is now the most diverse generation, and now we're getting into the periods of time where whites are not the majority anymore, and what that really means for the idea of a very hetero binary way of looking at marriage and love, and also what that means with what's going on in the world. And one of those things when I looked more into research was that Gen Z actually isn't static. We move cities a lot, changing our style, switching up jobs frequently. And we can even see through this through the pandemic that's happened with jobs being able to be remote. And so you don't necessarily have to be in the town or even within the area of where your job is from, and what that means. And so because personal connections go along with that, Gen Z doesn't really expect our relationships to be stuck in time with us, as we as I talked about earlier with the idea of situationships, we really embrace the gray area. We really take the time as a generation to really be in the moment, I guess you could say, and be in the now with what a relationship is, and knowing that it might end and being okay with that. Um, but Gen Z as a whole, when we do feel ready, choosing a long-term partner means someone who can match our own personal values. Going back to us being a very conscious generation and involved in a lot of social movements, usually because we are more left or liberal leaning generation. One of the statistics talked about how actually I can go back. No, I can't go back to it real quickly. Okay, I can. That 71% say it's a deal breaker if potential matches have different political views in them. So we look for people who aren't racist, who aren't openly racist, who aren't openly homophobic, and who may have the same ideas that when it comes to us about these things that maybe could be overlooked in the past, but now that are right in front and center in our current society, that really does have an impact in who we choose to be our partner. Next, I'm going to talk about what marriage really looks like now, because it is very different from what it looked like in the past. So The Knot, which is a news outlet, had some statistics for Gen Z. The most popular maid that women in the study found their fiance was in college or grad school. 1 in 4 meeting that way, which I thought was a very interesting. And I'll talk more about the reason why that may be later. But it's very interesting because if we are such a technology driven we're generation Z, or as or iGen, and so that we're still having a lot of in-person connections. Gen Z also believes the average age they'll get married is 27. This is very different than if we look back in the past, because traditionally we had a very binary understanding of what a marriage was. Then a man was the breadwinner, and the woman was the person who cooked, clean, and took care of the children. This usually meant that the only aspiration that there was to have a nuclear family, have those kids. And so we did traditionally see women getting married, and others as a whole getting married at a younger age. But now it's starting to go up 27. And when I was doing research, some numbers of 32 were also floating around, which is definitely pushing it. I think right now, though, the average that we are looking at is around 27. 92% state that being financially stable before marriage is very important. We are definitely a generation that grew up with things such as the recession during Obama's time, I want to say. But that being able to provide not only for our partners in an equal way, but for the children whom we may bring into our lives or into this world. It has become more important for us that we are able to financially support them. Gen Z is also increasingly less religious than older generations, making our generation less inclined to tie the knot. While fewer and fewer weddings were centered in religious practice, marriage is still a religious institution. An increasing number or less traditional couples don't believe they need a ceremony to commit to one another. With us being very socially aware, we definitely look at where these institutions came from and what are they trying to really say with their message. And so, but even besides fewer and fewer people having weddings in churches, fewer and fewer people are having weddings at all, looking at what in our society marriage really means, and do we really need it in terms of like tax breaks, different things like that, really understanding what comes with marriage rather than just freely wholeheartedly going into it, which I thought was pretty interesting idea to look at. I think one of the important parts to always remember is when we do have huge paradigm shifts in our society, we usually do have the people who are opposed to it, who are not ready for that shift. A lot of the times we can see a lot of older generations pushing back against Gen Z, going not really going into, but the idea of Trumpism and how media is shown through that. So I wanted to shine a light on what the other side is and also say why the other side is wrong. So Ohio State candidate JD Vance warned conservative think tanks about a civilization crisis marking the decline in marriage and birth rates, which he said we're going to promote we're going to be childless, that basically that we just don't want to do anything that the older generations did, and somehow we're just not going to produce children, or there'll be no children left. But I'm going to say he's very wrong. He's very wrong due to the fact that census data shows that low marriage rates among millennials and Gen Z. So this does factor in with millennials, the only research I could find, but Gen Z is definitely in there. Only 29% of 18 to 34-year-olds were married in 2018, compared to 59% in 1978. So this negates the headlines that are saying there's a marriage crisis, the end of marriage in America, that we're going to be childless, all these things like that. We can also definitely see through that the age of marriage isn't going away. It's just gotten higher. And that doesn't necessarily mean that as a generation, we're pushing back on the idea as a whole, but rather taking a step back and looking at this and why things are. This is also very wrong because of how media has been how media is shown to us with shows like The Bachelorette and other shows that continue to come out. To name a couple: Too Hot to Handle, Love is Blind, Love Island UK, US, and Australia, Sexy Beast, and HBO Max even had a new show called F-Boy Island, which pits earnest suitors against each other, or F-Boys, which in the article BBC defined as men who pride themselves on casual flings in a cheeky battle for the island's women. So we can definitely tell that attraction, when you watch these shows, you can see that sex, marriage, all these things, children are very still relevant. It's just how we go about them is different, so that's something to definitely keep in mind too. But the shows on these streaming platforms such as Netflix and HBO Max definitely aren't going away. If anything, through the pandemic, they've even picked up. It'll be interesting to see how the rates, now that things are starting to open up back again and we're starting to learn how to live with COVID, how that will pan out over the next few years. Next, I wanted to talk about the impact of dating apps. So heterosexual couples in the US are now more likely to meet a romantic partner online via than any other connection, which I thought was very interesting, especially due to the fact that we are such a technological place and they meet romantic partners online, but at the same time, we're in the study, women were looking for people in college and grad school, but I'll talk about it a little bit, but it's interesting between how even now the research has been done is starting to shift through the huge impact that the pandemic had, and the idea that people meeting college and grad school, I think is definitely more of a towards where we are now in society rather than the very beginning of Gen Z and the very beginning of platforms such as Tinder. So a 2017 survey found that 39% of such couples reported meeting their partner online, compared to 22% in 2009. Nearly half of all 18 to 29-year-olds say they've used a dating app in their life, according to a 2019 Pew Research Center study. So that I thought that was very interesting because it shows how prominent this technology is, and also how addicting it can be. I know from personal use and from even talking with friends, the idea of just being able to swipe left or right seems so simple, yet that is the case, that it almost kind of turns it into a game, kind of just swiping left, right, left, right. And that's kind of where on the side here, the fact of Bumble reporting a 70% increase in video calls and Tinder exceeding 3 billion swipes in one day for the first time in March 2020. And I think, again, paying attention to that date, March 2020, is very intriguing, since that is right when the pandemic hit and everyone became inside and didn't really know what to do. And I think people were still reaching out for those little human connections they could give. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But dating apps also revolve in teaching us about new trends that come around, such as the idea of ghosting, which I was talking about in the beginning, with the statistics about ghosting. But usually we define ghosting as abruptly ending communication with someone without explanation, through text or other social media platforms. This is something that, as technology and dating apps have grown, obvious, not obviously, but other generations such as Generation X, millennials, or even boomers definitely did not have, as they did not have the same technology we do have today. So it's pretty interesting to look at those factors when it comes to how much the world of dating has changed, even within the past 5 to 10 years. So that was interesting to look at. And lastly, I wanted to look at the outlook of dating and marriage, or how Generation Alpha may deal with these things. So the idea of being consciously single is rising. It became a big, because it's still rising, and because of where we are in our society and the conversations we are starting to have, I do not see that idea rising was definitely pan out anytime soon. I can definitely see that becoming a thing. It'll be interesting, even bigger of a thing. It'll be interesting to see how, as Generation Alpha starts to get into the age of dating, how this idea of consciously single will change how they start having relationships, like realer relationships around like the middle school age. So also looking at how, even though the research I did is very prominent and very relevant, how, as I've been mentioning, through the pandemic, things have already changed, and how the outlook of things will be different in like 5 to 6 years, to even compare to the research I have now, since the pandemic had such a big impact on our life. So 53% of people changed their mind about dating through the pandemic, realizing it's actually okay to be partnerless, at least for a while. This was very interesting. I would say trend that went on, or new conversation that went on during the middle of the pandemic, with like being kind to yourself, self-love, taking time for understanding that you can't always give to a partner if you can't take care of yourself first. And more singles are interested in going on sober dates, where traditionally one of the popular places to meet up on a first date would be like a bar. Now we're seeing more singles who are interested in going dates in a cafe or some activity that doesn't necessarily revolve around alcohol. Now, the question that daters are starting to ask one another are far more forward to the point now. This trend has been dubbed coronisty, or coronavirus honesty, that there's definitely been a closed off feature and the lack of human interaction that we got through Gen Z, and even not in Gen Z, in the pandemic, but even during the pandemic when we were locked up, a lot of things did happen, such as things like George Floyd. And so because big questions and big conversations are on the table. Through research, we're seeing that people who are looking to date or looking for a connection are more likely to be forward. And so again, the next couple of years, it will be interesting to see how this coronavirus honesty changes. Will we have a new name for it? What will it look like? And all these other things. But throughout all of this research I did, I don't see marriage nor dating going away anytime soon. Just the way we look at it and the way we explore things. And that's all I have.